Okay, here we go. Let's see how far we get. Chapter 11. Once out of the grip of the great current, Sibel wrestled with the gaudy striped mainsail, untying it from the runners on the boom and folding it away neatly in its bag. Then he and Manoli bent the bright red southern sail to the boom and mast. Practice had made it a smooth operation, though the first time Manoli and he had changed the sail halfway to the southern continent, it had taken them hours, with him cursing at his ineptness and she patiently explaining the trick. No sooner had they hauled the red sail up the mast than the wind, which had so favored their journey, dropped to a mere whisper. With a sigh, Manoli surveyed the bright blue and cloudless sky and then laughed as she sank to the deck by the all but motionless tiller handle. Wouldn't you just know? All right, weather eye, breeze at sunset? Possibly. Usually does come up again then, she replied, squinting up to see what made Sibel so irritable. Sorry, Manoli, he said, running his hands through wind-disheveled hair. He dropped to the deck beside her. You're not worried about Pemer, are you? Something you've kept from me? No, girl, I've kept nothing from you. Her anxious query seemed at this moment more of an accusation to him than a plea for reassurance, and he had answered with more asperity than was customary for him. She was quiet, though he could sense her confusion in his manner. He was unable to explain it to himself. I didn't mean to snap, Manoli, he said, realizing that she wouldn't speak until he had. I just don't know what's gotten into me. I honestly believe we'll find Pemer in the south. Maybe we ought to have taken someone else to help with the sailing. No, it's not that. Again his tone was churlish. He bit his lips together, took a deep breath, and carefully added, You know I like sailing. Better, I like sailing with you alone. That came out sounding more like himself, and he gave her a smile. Manoli started to respond to his oblique apology, but then stared at his face, her eyes widening. Suddenly she glanced skyward, where the fire lizards were aerially following the skiff in swoops and glides. She watched them for a long moment, frowning slightly as she saw one dive into the waves. Sibel, puzzled by her abrupt curiosity, identified the fisher as his own Kimi, and smiled indulgently as she brought the neatly captured yellowtail back to the prow of the ship. Oddly, the other stayed aloft, while Kimi tore savagely into the flesh of her still struggling prey. Sibel wondered why the other 3 fire lizards didn't come to share the feast, but the thought didn't absorb him long. The ferocity with which Kimi ate fascinated him. He felt as if he were somehow involved in tearing the strips, as if he could savor the warm, salty flesh in his mouth, as if... I'm sending Beauty to Torek at Southern Hold. She can't stay here now, Sibel. Sibel heard Manoli's voice, but made no sense of the words. His entire attention was concentrated on the unusual actions of his fire lizard queen. He wanted to go to her, but he couldn't move. He found that he was alternately clutching his hands and then rubbing his sweating palms against his legs. He was unbearably hot and tore at his shirt to open the throat. Oh, he heard Manoli exclaim, what else can I do? I can't send Rocky and Diver away. That's not fair to Kimi. We're too far from land to raise more fire lizards, and there's not a breath of wind to attract them here. Sibel pulled off his shirt and tossed it aside. The coolness of the day seemed to have no effect on the heat that consumed him. Then he noticed the 2 bronze fire lizards crouching on the roof of the small cabin. They made no attempt to join Kimi in her feast. She was growling too, her eyes glowingly orange at the 2 impertinent bronzes, and she seemed to be glowing in the sunlight. Glowing? Unwilling to share food? What had Manoli mumbled about sending Beauty away? And to Torek? Why would she send Torek another message? What was the matter with Kimi? He wanted to reprimand her, but could frame no message in his mind. And why were those bronzes waiting? Why didn't they go away and leave Kimi? Why? The why suddenly penetrated Sibel's fire lizard-linked confusion. Kimi eating alone, savagely. Manoli sending Beauty, another queen, away. Kimi glowing golden and taunting the bronzes, her good friends, with her staring, whirling, orange-red eyes. Kimi was about to fly, and it was Manoli's bronzes who would fly her. A surge of elation swept Sibel, who could scarcely believe his good fortune, and yet... Manoli? He turned to her, hands outstretched, palms up, pleading with her and apologizing for what he knew was about to happen, since there were only the 2 of them on this becalmed boat in the middle of the wind-still sea. He hadn't wanted Manoli coerced. as she now must be, he'd wanted to be in full command of himself, not overridden by the mating instinct of Kimi. "It's all right, Sibel. It's all right." Smiling, Manoli put her hands in his and let herself be drawn into his arms where he had so yearned to have her. As if their contact had been a signal, Kimi uttered a shriek and flung herself skyward from the prow, the two bronze fire lizards a length behind her. Sibel wasn't standing on the deck with Manoli in his arms. He was with Kimi, exulting in her strength, in her flight, determined to outsmart those who pursued her. Just let them try to catch her. Never had her wings responded so fully to her demands. Never had she flown so high, soaring, veering, and gliding. The sun flowed across her body, its rays burning into her eyes as she flew on and ever upwards. The heat was unendurable. She glided obliquely to the right, caught movement below her, and sweeping her wings back, dropped down, screaming with delight as she fell between the two startled bronzes. One of them tried to entangle her with his lashing tail and fell, his flight rhythm disrupted. She beat upward again, calling defiance and deliberately cutting across the path of the second bronze. But in her desire to flaunt her flight superiority, she brushed just too close to him, and he veered, jamming his wingtip against hers. Her forward speed was momentarily checked. Before she could get away from him, he had caught her, neck twining hers in that instant. Locked together, they fell towards the shimmering sea so far below. On the tiny bright oblong that was but a mote on the glistening water, Sibel and Manoli too were together, lips, bodies, hearts, and minds as they, linked by and in the love of their fire lizards, experienced and repeated the joy that enveloped Kimi and Diver. Do you guys know what just happened?
Nope.
Kimi went on her mating flight and Manoli's bronze flew him. And so Sibel and Manoli are getting it on the boat. The flapping of the untended sail roused Sibel first, the rising sea breeze cooling his cheek. He moved aside, shaking his head, trying to orient himself. Manoli stirred against him, awakened by the same sea sounds. Startled, she opened her eyes and saw him, propped on his elbow above her. Surprise, and then memory, changed the color of her sea-green eyes. Holding his breast, Sibel watched, fearful of her reaction. Her smile was tender as she lifted her hand and brushed his hair back from his eyes. "What chance did you have, dear Sibel, with Rocky and Diver so determined?" "It wasn't just Kimi," he said in a hurried voice. "You know that, don't you?" "Of course I know, Sibel." Her fingers lingered on his cheek, his lips. "But you always stand back and defer to our master." She did not hide from Sibel then how much she loved Master Robinson, nor would that ever come between them, since they each loved the man in their separate ways. "But I have so wished." The ominous creak of the boom swinging against the cockpit warned her just in time to pull him back against her, out of its way. "I wish," said Sibel in a growl, "that the bloody wind didn't choose to rise right now." "We need the wind, Sibel," she replied, laughing with a spontaneous gaiety that drew a laugh from him, because they had finally spoken of what had kept them apart too long.
What?
Well, they both loved Master Robinson, and so Sibel didn't express any interest in Manoli because he didn't want to come between her and Robinson if she loved Robinson. Okay?
Yep.
But they're both happy that they got it on. Bow, chicka, wow. I just embarrassed my daughter. He put up his hand to grab the boom before it could swing back. She half rose and reached the lines to secure the boom, then pulled herself onto the seat to unlash the tiller. As Sibel rose to join her, he caught sight of a curled ball of bronze and gold on the forward deck, but Kimi and Diver were too soundly asleep to be roused by considerations of sea and wind. He envied them. "Where did Rocky go?" he asked Manoli, who frowned slightly in thought. "He either joined Beauty or found himself a wild green. I suspect the latter." "Wouldn't you know?" asked Sibel, surprised. Manoli shook her head from side to side with a half-smile, and Sibel realized that she'd been unaware of anything except their rapport with their two fire lizards. He relaxed, thoroughly content with their new understanding. "If this breeze continues to follow, we'll make southern by tomorrow high sun," she said, and deftly played out the line, making the most of the wind that filled the red sail. Then she indicated that Sibel should bridge the distance between them in the cockpit. Neither left each other for very long, all through that brilliant, lovely night. Manoli's sea sense was acute, for the sun had just reached its zenith when they eased the little skiff into the pleasant cove that served the southern hold as harbor. Sibel counted the ships bobbing at anchor and wondered where the largest 3 vessels were. They'd seen none fishing, as the great eastern current had raced them toward their destination. Not that Sibel expected anyone in the southern hold to be moving about in the heavy heat of the high sun. Suddenly Beauty appeared, chittering a wild welcome. Rocky arrived more sedately, settling on the tide boom. Manoli scooped him from his perch and caressed him, murmuring loving reassurances until Sibel heard her laugh. What's so amusing? He must have found a green. He looks far too smug, but he's trying to make me feel guilty. Not your fault Diver lived up to his name. Hello down there! The loud hail attracted their attention up to the small precipice that bulged out above the harbor. The tall, tanned figure of the southern holder, Torek, waved an imperious arm at them. No use sweltering. Come in where it's cool. With Beauty and Rocky as escort, they waded ashore, leaving Kimi and Diver still asleep. Sibel firmly captured Manoli's hand as they raced across the hot sand to the steps that would lead to the top of the white stone cliff, which rose above the sea to make a safe hold for its inhabitants. Torek was gone from the halfway lookout when they reached it, but they were both accustomed to the southerners' habits, and indeed it was only sensible to get out of the burgeoning heat. Torek had been able to keep the lush vegetation of the south only so far from the entrance to the cool white caves by strewing the area deeply with seashells. The crunch and break of shell also served to warn the hold of visitors. Torek awaited them just inside the hold's entrance, gripping each by the arm with fingers that threatened to leave bruise marks. You were mighty short on words with that message Beauty bore me, he said as he escorted them to his private quarters. The southern hold differed from the northern ones in many respects, and at this time of day was uninhabited. The large low cavern was used for mealtimes, bad storms, or threadfall. The southerners preferred to live apart, in shelter set in the shade of the thick forest of the bluff. When the wind was from the wrong quarter, this cavern could be breathlessly hot. Today, however, as Torek handed them each long tubes of cooled fruit juices, the temperature was a distinct drop from the heat without. To expand on Beauty's terse message, said Sibel, without the usual Harper preambles, for Torek was a blunt-spoken man and appreciated the same in return. Moran is dead, and his successor, Lord Dector, wishes it clearly understood that he is in no way to be bound by previous commitments. Fair enough. I'd expected it. Marjorie and Takul won't like it, and they may try Dector's resolve. He'll remain firm. So he has no problem. Then Torek laughed to himself, shaking his head from side to side in amusement. Hey, Chaz, that's really loud. Could you stop? No, Marjorie won't like it, but it'll do the old one good to be thwarted. She was going to give Moran every dead fire lizard egg she could find for sending her a half-empty sack. Half-empty? Sibel caught Manoli's eye. Yes, the sack arrived with the top loosened, and she's certain some of the shipment, some materials she's been plaguing the master weaver for, dropped out between. Why? Torek caught the significant glances between the Harpers. Oh. That missing lad you queried me about 7 days back, you think he came south in it? It's a possibility. It never occurred to me to connect the two before now. Torek stroked his cheek thoughtfully. A small lad? Yes, he'd doubtless have fit in that sack. Anything else about him I should know, perhaps? Sibel thought how like Torek to want answers before he gave his own. A queen fire lizard egg was involved. Oh-ho! And Torek's eyes crinkled with satisfaction. Then it's not a possibility anymore, but a probability that your lad got here. He stressed the word got strangely, but went on before Sibel could question his emphasis. 3 threadfalls ago, Weirmen went after a wary circle. Most of the time that means fire lizard hatching, so they do stir themselves to investigate. Torek gave a sour laugh. Not that that energy will profit them now if this Dector fellow won't follow Moran's ways. The strange thing was that when they reached the area, the wherries flitted away through the forest, and they found only a queen shell on the beach. They spent a good deal of time going up and down that strand, but there wasn't any trace of a full clutch. Peemer does have his friend after all, cried Manoli, grabbing Sibel and dancing about with him in her relief. Peemer? That's your missing boy? Hey, stop that. You'll set every fire lizard in the place a wing. Kimi and Diver swooped into their cavern at some point, and with Beauty and Rocky bugling their delight, some of the southern fire lizards were also reacting. Sibel and Manoli called out their 4 to order, and Torek sent his away. "Yes, it's Pemer who's been missing, our apprentice," said Manoli, so jubilant that for a moment Sibel thought she'd swing Torek into their joyful antics. "He and I were at Moran's gather," said Sibel. "Somehow he got into the hold itself and purloined the queen fire lizard egg. Moran was livid." "I can well imagine," said Torek with a snort. "Only none of his men could find Pemer or the egg. Kimi said she couldn't reach him," Sibel went on. "That was when he'd hidden in the sack," Manoli said. "Oh, that wretched, clever rascal." "More clever than he knew, or could guess," Sibel continued, for Torek's expression told him that he didn't think so highly of Pemer's escapade. The harper explained to Torek all that had occurred, after Pemer's daring theft, the fear of the main contenders for the holding that Ben and Weir would discover Moran's dealings with the southern old-timers. The heirs apparent now wanted no part of the succession, nor did they want the hold in contention, so they pressured Moran to name a successor who would then try to placate the Ben and Weir leaders. But Moran had collapsed, and both the Master Harper Healer and the Master Harper were summoned, for the Harper could act as mediator. He convoked the other Lord Holders and the High Reaches Weir leader to force Lord Moran to name his successor. About the methods, Sibel remained discreet. Nor did Torek inquire, since Sibel's recitation was limited to facts rather than storytelling embellishments. "So we think," Sibel finished, "that since Kimi specifically said it was too dark, as in a sack, and she couldn't find Pemer, or room enough to get to him, he did secrete himself in a sack, which the old-timers collected that night. I saw the dragons, and brought here. That would also explain why none of our fire lizards could find a trace of him anywhere in Nabol." Torek had listened with keen attention to Sibel's summary, but now he cocked his head to one side and made a rueful noise with his tongue against his teeth. "It's true, a boy could have fit in that sack, and it's true that a queen fire lizard was found, but," and he held up his hand warningly, "thread fell that day." "Pemer knew you could live holdless through Threadfall," said Manoli, with the firmness of one trying to convince self. "Wherries were circling that shell. They could have got the little queen at hatching." "Not if Pemer was alive. And I know he was," said Manoli, more stoutly now and utterly convinced. "Is that place far from here? Could your queen take our fire lizards? If Pemer's anywhere about, they'll find him." Torek was dubious, but he called up his queen. To the surprise of both Harpers, the queen didn't, as Kimi or Beauty would have done, land on Torek's shoulder, but hovered, awaiting his pleasure. Torek issued the sort of order one would give a stupid drudge. She chirped at Kimi and Beauty, disdaining the two bronzes, and flitted out of the cavern, the other 4 fire lizards right behind her.
Is Torek being mean to his fire lizard?
He's being strict with her. Lord Moran's death won't bother them, and Torek jerked his head in the direction of the southern Weir for a while. They just brought in all they'll need for some time. I would prefer that we somehow keep them supplied. I, and he jerked his thumb at his chest in emphasis, do not wish to jeopardize my arrangements with Lessa and Flar. They, and again he meant the old-timers, don't care how they get what they think they need. Moran was just convenient. He took the Harper's solemn assurance of assistance as his due, but then grinned, not pleasantly. Has any one of Moran's people figured out just how many green fire lizard eggs got foisted off on him? Torek plainly thought little of people who would be taken in by such deception. "You forget that the small holders don't know much about fire lizards," said Sibel. "In fact, the enormous fire lizard population at Nabol is one of the reasons why Pemer and I were there, to make certain Moran was the source of so many green fire lizards." Torek half rose, his usually controlled expressions showing anger. "No one suspected me of cheating traitors." "No," Sibel said, though that had been one of his problems. "Don't forget that I collected the clutches you sent north in barter, but it was necessary for the Harper to find the real culprit. Green clutches could have been brought in by sailors who have been so conveniently losing themselves in southern waters." "Oh, all right, then." Torek subsided, his honor unchallenged. "The old-timers have not questioned those lost sailors?" "No," said Torek, shrugging negligently. "So long as the sails are read, they never have bothered to count the number of ships we really own." Torek then noticed that they had drained their juices, so he replenished the cool drinks. "Have you some ships out now?" asked Sibel, because he'd thought it odd to see so few at anchor when the sun was high. Torek smiled again, his good humor completely restored by Sibel's observation. "You are welcome, Harper, since the ships have sailed on your account, or I should say Master Olddive's. It's harvest time for the numbweed, and for certain other herbs, grasses, and such like that Sharis, as the good man, requires. If you stay until they return, then you can sail home full laden." "Good news, Torek, but we'd best sail home laden with Pemer as well." The Southerner clicked his tongue pessimistically. As I said, there have been 3, maybe 4 threadfalls since that queen eggshell was found. You don't know Peemer, said Manoli, so insistent that Torque raised his eyebrows in surprise at her fervor. Maybe, but I know how other northerners act in threadfall. Torque was plainly contemptuous. You're having trouble with their adaptation here? Asked Sibel, worrying that the Harper's masterful solution of sending holdless men south to Torque in unobtrusive numbers was in jeopardy. No trouble, said Torque, dismissing that consideration with a wave of his hand. They learn to cope holdless or stay holdbound without the additional privileges of being ranked as holders here. Some have adapted rather well, he admitted grudgingly. Then he noticed Manoli's anxious glances toward the entrance. Oh, I told her to give the forest a good raking, too. The fire lizards will take a while if my queen has followed her orders. Now that drink is not enough to soothe the sea thirst. There's sure to be ripe fruit cooling in the tanks. He rose and went to the kitchen area of the cavern, where he scooped a huge green rinded fruit from the tank set in the wall. Generally, we save heavier eating for the evening when the heat is eased. He sectioned the fruit and carried a platter of the pink flesh slices to the table. Best fruit in the world for quenching thirst. It's mainly water. Sibel and Manoli were licking their fingers for the last of the succulent juices when a twittering pair of fire lizards swooped in. Beauty and Kimi made immediately for their friend's shoulders. Rocky and Diver settled near Manoli on the table, but Torque's queen hovered, chirping out a message, her eyes whirling with the orange red of distress. I told you he might not survive, said Torque. My queen really looked for any trace of human, too. Manoli hid her face on the pretext of reassuring her fire lizards, who were imagining to her endless distances of forests and deserted stretches of beach and sandy waste. You sent them west, said Sibel, grasping at any theory that would give them hope, to the place where the eggshells were discovered. If I know Peemer, he wouldn't have stayed anywhere that he had left clues. Could he have worked his way east, and be further down this side of the southern weir? Torque gave a snort of laughter. He could be any bloody where in the whole great Southlands, but I doubt it. You northerners don't like to be holdless and threadfall. I managed quite well, thank you, said Manoli, her face bleak despite the sharpness of her reminder. There are undeniably exceptions, said Torque smoothly, inclining his head to indicate he meant her no insult. Peemer avoided discovery by fire lizards at Nebold, he told me, by thinking of between, said Sibel. He could have tried that trick again today. He'd have no way of knowing they were our friends, but there's one call he won't ignore or hide from. And what would that be? Asked the skeptical holder. Sibel caught Manoli's suddenly hopeful expression. Drums! Peemer will answer a call on drums. Drums? Torque threw back his head in an honest guffaw of surprise. Yes, drums, said Sibel, beginning to find Torque's attitude offensive. Where's your drum heights? Why would we need drum heights in Southern? It took the astounded Harpers a little while to understand that drum heights, traditional in every hold in the North, had never been installed in the Southern single hold. Granted, there were now small holdings established as far to the east as the Island River, but messages came back and forth either by fire lizard or by ship. To Sibel's impatient query for any sort of drums in the hold, Torque said they had a few to aid in rhythm and dances. These were found in the quarters of Senator, the hold's harper, who roused from his midday rest to show them to Sibel and Manoli. They were, as Sibel sadly found, no better than dance drums, with no resonance to speak of. Still in all, message drums would be handy to have nowadays, Torque, Senator said. Easier than sailing down the coast to discuss something. Just drum 'em up here. Safer, too. Those old-timers never learned drum measures. Come to think of it, I'm not sure how much I remember myself. Senator regarded the journeyman Harpers with an abashed surprise. Haven't had to use drum talk since I came here with Fnor. It wouldn't be hard to refresh your memory, Senator, but we must have proper drums. And that would take time with all the Master Smith has on his plate right now, said Sibel, shaking his head with the disappointment he felt. He'd been so sure. Must drums be made of metal? Asked Torque. These have wooden frames. He tapped the stretched hide across the larger drum, and it rattled in response. The metal message drums are large, to resound, Sibel began. But not necessarily metal, just something big enough, hollow enough over which to stretch your hide and resonate, asked Torque, ignoring the interruption. What about a tree trunk, say? And he began to hold out his arms, widening the circle while Sibel startled in disbelief at the area he encompassed. About this big. That ought to make a bloody loud drum. Tree I'm thinking of came down in the last storm.
Mom, can I use sharpener on this paper?
Sure, but be careful not to bleed through on your leg. I know things grow bigger here in the south, Torek, said Sibel, skeptical in his own turn. But a tree trunk as big as you suggest? Well, now, they don't grow that big. Torek threw back his head, laughing at Sibel's incredulity. He clapped Senator on the shoulder. We'll show this disbelieving northerner, won't we, Harper? Senator grinned apologetically at his crafters, spreading his hands out to indicate that Torek was indeed telling the truth. Further, it's not all that far from the hold. We could make it there and back before dinner, said Torek, well pleased with himself, and strode out of the Harper's quarters ahead of the other three to rouse assistance. While Sibel didn't doubt that the fallen tree was not far from the southern hold, it was also not an easy trek through steamy hot forest where the trail had to be hacked out afresh. But when they finally reached the tree, it was every bit as large in girth as Torek had promised. Sibel felt much like Manoli, awed as they reached out to caress the smooth wood of the fallen giant. The insects that had burrowed out the monster's core had also made meals of its bark until only a thin shell remained, the last skin of the once living tree. Even that shell had begun to rot away in the steam and rain on its environment. Will this make you enough drums, Harperman? Asked Torek, delighted to confound them. Enough for every holding you got, with more left over, said Sibel, running his eyes down the fallen trunk. Surely it must be several dragon lynx. Queen dragons. It must be the biggest, oldest tree ever grown on Pern. How many threadfalls had it survived? Well, how many shall we cut you today? Asked Torek, gesturing for the double-handed saw that had been carried by his holders. I'll settle for one just now, said Sibel. From here, and he marked the distance with an arm and his body, pointing to the limit with his right forefinger by his ribs, to here. That would make a good, deep, long-carrying sound when hide is stretched. Senator, who had come with them, stooped to pick up a thick, knobby-ended branch and pounded the tree trunk experimentally. Everyone was surprised at the hollow boom that resulted. The fire lizards, who'd been perched on the surface, lifted with shrieks of protest. Grinning, Sibel held out his hand to Senator for the stick. He beat out the phrase, "Apprentice, report." He grinned more broadly as the majestic tones echoed through the forest and startled a veritable shower of tree-dwelling insects and snakes, shaken from their perches by the unexpected loud reverberations. Why move it? Asked Torek. You could hear this at the back of the mountains. Ah, but cite this on that landing over your harbor, and a message would carry to that island river of yours, said Sibel. Then we'll cut your drum, Harper, said Torek, gesturing for another man to take the opposite handle of the big saw. He held the blade for the initial cut. Then we shall take the rest out in sections as big as we can carry them, he said, thrusting mightily at the end of the saw. With a man of Torek's brawn and the willing help of the other holders, the first drum section was quickly detached from the trunk. A long pole was cut, vines quickly laced to secure the section to the carrier, and the party was soon making its way back to the southern hold. By the time they had arrived, Sibel and Manoli were dripping with sweat, tortured by scratches and insect bites, which did not seem to bother the tougher, tanned hides of the southerners. Sibel wondered if he could find the energy to cover the drum that day. Sibel had firmly assured him that there were hides large enough, since herd beasts also grew larger here in the south, to fit this mammoth drum, but the journeyman was determined to work as long and as hard as the southern holder if he had to, and he had to find Peemer. They had positioned the drum in front of the cavern for the sun to dry up the insects, so Torek announced, when the big holder frowned at his guests. Man, you will die an early death if you work this hard all the time. Torek waved toward the westering sun. The day is nearly over. This drum making can wait till morning. Now we all need a wash, and his gesture went seaward. That is, if you Harpers swim. Manoli gave a sigh, partly composed of relief that Sibel was not going to insist on finishing the drum tonight, and partly disgust, since Torek would never remember that she had not only lived holdless, but had been a sea holder's daughter and could outswim him. Sibel hesitated briefly before he surrendered to Torek's suggestion. The seawater, not as warm as Sibel had anticipated, was indeed refreshing as well as relaxing. The 4 fire lizards zipped in and out of the gentle evening waves, chittering with delight to frolic with their friends. Though if Manoli disappeared for long beneath the waves, her 3 fire lizards dove after her, pulling her surfaceward by her hair. Suddenly, Torek's queen, who had held herself aloof from the antics of the visitors, hovered about Torik's head, twittering urgently. Torik glanced around. Following his gaze, Manoli and Sibel saw 3 red-sailed sloops, their sides lined with people, rounding the arm of land that protected the southern harbor. "The harvesters have returned," said Torik to the harpers. "I'll just see if all is well. Stay on and enjoy yourselves." With strong strokes of his powerful arms, he made a diagonal line to the shore that would intercept the landing of the lead ship. "Sometimes that man is too much," she said, shaking her head at this latest exhibition of the Southerner's strength. "Which is as well for me," said Sibel, laughing, and pulled her under just to let her fire lizards rescue her. They played that game a bit, reveling in the freedom of the water and its coolness, until Manoli suddenly wondered if she had enough energy left to swim back to shore. But they got there safely, fire lizards escorting, and paused to lean against the seawall to catch their breaths before continuing back up to the hold. Torik was now directing the unloading,